Whenever we're learning a topic, what I would do is that after I've learned the topic, I would ask myself, does this make sense, firstly? And secondly, could I explain this to a 5-year-old? And this is the famous Feynman technique, named after the famous physicist Richard Feynman, who was aptly known as the Great Explainer. And Feynman was a big deal back in the day before he died because he was able to distill really complicated things in a way that made sense to the layperson. And the reason he was able to do that is because he understood the topic so well. And once you've understood a topic well enough, you can explain it to anyone. And that is the key principle behind the Feynman technique. And that's our key litmus test for whether we really understand something. So let's say in medicine, I'm trying to learn about how atrial fibrillation works, for example. I might explain that, oh, well, atrial fibrillation is actually this heart rhythm where the atria are quivering. And therefore, that means that we're going to get stasis of blood. So blood is going to stay in the atrium because it's not being contracted and propelled into the ventricles. And we know that when blood is static in the atrium, then it's going to clot. And that clot can go into the ventricles and then can go into the lungs or can go into the brain, and that would be bad. And so that's me sort of explaining it to a 5-year-old, but this whole 5-year-old thing is a little bit of a metaphor really, because obviously a 5-year-old wouldn't know what the atria of the heart are, but you know, that is reasonable assumed knowledge when I'm trying to explain it to a friend. The way I think about it is, could I feasibly explain this to a friend? And if I can talk through atrial fibrillation in a way that makes sense in my head and makes sense in a way that I can explain it to someone else, it means I truly understand the topic. But if I'm trying to understand any topic and I ever get to the point where I think I can't explain why A leads to B, like I don't get how they got from this step to that step, that means I know that I wouldn't be able to explain it to a 5-year-old or explain it to a friend. Because if I was explaining it to a friend or a 5-year-old or a student or whatever, they would ask why. And the more times they ask why, the more I'm sort of testing my understanding of the topic. And if I can't feasibly answer the question of why, that means I don't understand it well enough. And so at that point, I would go back to the source material, to Google, Wikipedia, textbook, lecture notes, and I would try and figure out what is the answer to that particular question. Like, why can't I explain that bit of it? And then once I've got that piece of information, then it'll start clicking in my head again and be like, oh, this makes sense. I can now explain this to a 5-year-old. And so that's basically the Feynman technique in action. Moral of the story, we need to understand stuff before we can do anything else with it. And in order to understand stuff, we need to be able to explain it to a 5-year-old, explain it to a friend. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.